What are the resources, tools, approaches, or methods you apply when it comes to fraud, misbehavior, or non-compliance? I will take up the topic of the fraud drivers, which I started to introduce in the last episode, number 5. Today, you will learn how the fraud triangle could become your partner in crime during prevention, detection, and reaction to fraud on a strategic and operational level. Good to have you here.
Corporate integrity, fraud, non-compliance, and cybersecurity. Would you like to understand the root causes, detect threats, and take measurements to protect the most precious assets? As a leader, you need to be prepared and stay actionable in the event of an incident. Sonja Stirnimann talks in her podcast, The Human Factor, Corporate Integrity Matters, to leaders and entrepreneurs who want to have impact, foster corporate integrity, and act as role models. As an international expert for corporate governance and integrity, entrepreneur, and independent board member, she knows the challenges. Let her inspire you.
Welcome back to this new episode of the podcast, The Human Factor, Corporate Integrity Matters. You might be an integrity enthusiast, a business leader, a corporate integrity counsel, or on your way there. I'm your mentor when it comes to corporate integrity with impact. Founder of Corporate Integrity Concepts and the Corporate Integrity Academy, with the vision to protect and secure assets, reputation, and actionability, yours and the one of your organization. Why? Because corporate integrity matters. Let us make the world a place of corporate integrity and ethical leadership. And now, let's dive into the question why the fraud triangle is your partner in crime or is supposed to become one in the future. Whatever I have experienced over the last 2 decades of working in an environment where fraud is a daily business is that having a profound knowledge about the fraud drivers is key to understand the root causes of misbehavior. When we look back where the term white-collar crime comes from, which is explained in detail in episode 5, we know that occupational standing plays an important role. Edwin Sutherland defined the term as following: crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status during his occupation. With that common understanding, we go one step further to understand the different drivers which are based on Donald Creasey's thesis, which include: first, a person of trust; second, financial problems; third, individual value system to justify the action. That hypothesis will lead us to further analysis of the 3 drivers. And here I also like to mention the common beliefs I hear when I introduce the fraud triangle in companies, teams, or classrooms. Yes, it is a very simple tool. In my opinion, that's exactly the beauty of it. There are so many other approaches and tools out in the field when it comes to fathoming the causes of economic crime that when we speak about diamonds, cylinders, triangles, and squares, each approach will probably have its own justification. But the basis, however, is the original fraud triangle, which was explored and developed by Donald Creasey in the early 40s as part of his dissertation. What I have learned is that the easier it is to understand, the more often such tools are used. And that is exactly what I want to achieve with the fraud triangle. I would like to have it implemented in as many teams and organizations as possible to improve the awareness. Often, the simpler the tools, the better the results. Also here, we reduce the risk of false application by reducing it to the max. And if you would like to know to whom such tools like the fraud triangles are addressed, my spontaneous reaction would be to everybody, because you can already start explaining it to your kids. That is what I suggested a manager a few weeks ago, and he came back with a very resonating story how he introduced the fraud triangle to his daughter. More about that in a few minutes. So let me tell you this. The manager was part of a workshop we held a few weeks ago, of course virtually due to the ongoing pandemic we are currently in, when this podcast episode was recorded. During that workshop, the fraud triangle was one of the focus topics. And at the end, we also reflect on how they could now implement what they have learned back in their organization. What I usually like to do is to break a complex topic down to make it understandable to a 5-year-old child. I'm not saying that we need to oversimplify, but to make it radically clear, and that is what will stick at the end to anybody. So the manager decided to explain the fraud triangle to his daughter by using the misbehavior of stealing or borrowing, or however you would like to name it if a child is doing that. So it was the stealing of ice cream from the freezer. I'm not yet going to all the details of this story, but at the end of this episode, I will do so, promised, and you will hear what he told her daughter. Keep the ice cream in mind over the next few minutes when I explain the fraud triangle to you as a grown-up business leader. So let's take a step back and think of fire as a metaphor for economic crime. I will now use that metaphor for the next few steps. In order to prevent fire from breaking out, it is important to know what could start a fire and how to prevent it from breaking out. These conditions are also essential in understanding how to create effective and efficient anti-fraud programs, or how to conduct risk assessments as such, taking into account the different perspectives. The theory of the fraud triangle supports those responsible along the entire life cycle of white-collar crime and economic crime, and is applied in practice as a procedural method in various stages of the first prevention, then detection, and reaction, which needs to be identified. It's also part of the risk identification process, how we generate hypotheses, and how we prepare and conduct our interviews, or even though how the identification of relevant sources of information is done. So let's start with the first leg of the fraud triangle. So it's the motive. Do you remember back what it meant? A trusted persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable. That is the motive. In metaphors, a motive is the heat, and thus the strongest element of the fraud triangle. The motive pushes the individual to find a way to eliminate the perceived uncomfortable initial situation, so-called pressure, and to satisfy the needs in this regard. In the case of Cressey's hypothesis, this is the financial problem to be solved without involving a third party. It could be a personal pressure from family, friends, or society to achieve and or maintain a certain standard of living. That's also what we see when we directly discuss with the fraudsters. It could also be that they need to achieve a certain targets, maybe on the part of the employer, in order to receive the promised bonus payment as a result. Or it could also be the external pressure due to changes in the economic situation, the competition you have out there, and how you depend on customers, for example. Or maybe it's also some kind of addiction, financing addiction to gambling or drugs or whatever, in order to be able to keep it as long hidden as possible. Maybe it's also a lack of money due to expensive medication that has to be financed or for a sick family member. All these are motives we hear from our fraudsters. According to research, the motives of crimes are very often relationship-driven, also in the case of economic crimes and cybercrime. This means that it is about relationship constructs such as from and to ex-partners, jealous partners, school or work colleagues, or of course, also employers and other employees. The fact that a loyal and long-term relationship is also entered into between employee and employer, depending on the cultural background, should not be disregarded when you are going to analyze the motives. Often it is really underestimated, and you have to make sure and you have to keep in mind victims and perpetrators usually know each other already for a longer time. The second leg we talk about in the fraud triangle is the opportunity. Do you remember the second driver that we discussed last time? It was described as being aware of this problem can be secretly resolved by violating of the position of financial trust. An individual with a motive cannot commit a white-collar crime if the opportunity is not given. Opportunity is, with the metaphor I already started with, in reference to the fire, the fuel that makes the fire start and burn. The business model, the industry, as well as the structures and processes influence the internal control system of every company. This gives even more or less opportunities that can be used due to the professional position somebody has in. So the examples of opportunities and access are non-existing control mechanism, high turnover rates in key functions, establishment in high-risk areas depending on the regulations and standards to be complied with, for example, FCPA, UK Bribery Act or the OFAC, and a lack of segregation of duty. And this is one of my favorites, as I get so many excuses on that, and that's really one of the most important parts to take care on, the segregation of duties. And also overly complex organizational structures and transactions. So the opportunity can, due to the considerably increased regulatory and legal requirements in the past 15 years, be the most easily prevented procedurally and technically part within the framework of internal control systems. So this is the opportunity can really be managed. The introduction of a collective signature power already massively reduced the risk of fraud by internal perpetrators. But however, it must be considered that it is not the number of implemented controls that is decisive for the reduction of risk, but the design of these controls. Often I see there are too many controls which do not support the business at all and do also not prevent from fraud. So the identification of effective risk minimizing controls is of great importance and requires comprehensive knowledge in white-collar crime patterns, including the topic of non-compliance and cybercrime. Often that's forgotten. The opportunity in the form of access to relevant data plays also a key role in the territory of cybercrime. So without the authorization or opportunity to obtain, a cybercriminal's modus operandi is compromised. So there are many different methods of gaining access, like, for example, by withholding access authorizations, keys, badges, user accounts, or by using social engineering methods that enable the perpetrators to obtain sensitive data. And when we now go to the third leg of the fraud triangle, we talk about the rationalization. Do you remember the hypothesis on the rationalization? It was described as and are able to apply their own conduct in that situation, verbalizations which enable them to adjust their conceptions of themselves as trusted person with their conceptions of themselves as users of the entrusted funds or property. In metaphors spoken, the air or one's own justification keeps the fire burning. This third leg of fraud triangle is one of the most complex when it comes to anticipating and mitigating it. Please do not forget, the human brain is conditioned in such a way that no actions are taken unless they can be rationalized. Remember when you last time rationalized something for your behavior? And this begins with the simplest actions and ends with the most essential decisions. This is also the case when it comes to not complying with guidelines, regulations, and laws. These actions and justifications are rationalized to oneself and compared with the individual value system and personal beliefs. Recording and assessing this value system and its beliefs is highly relevant in the context of recruiting key positions for your organization. Often, it's not taken into consideration. But that's a topic we are going to discuss in one of the further episodes in the future. So the human factor with the potential to pose a risk or danger becomes more tangible through its components or rationalization. In practice, the justifications that the investigators learn from the perpetrators during the investigations are of particular importance because they allow the hypothesis to be further developed, give clues to possible evidence, and make it possible to read the offenders in terms of profiling. In the three legs of the fraud triangle, it can be said that they are very closely interdependent. They all go together. As mentioned at the beginning, fire requires several components to burn and stay burning. The same is true for white-collar crime. And the saying we have in our industry is, circumstances overrule morals. Because if these three conditions exist at the same time, the risk that an individual will be tempted to commit a white-collar crime increases to a maximum. As soon as one of the three legs breaks away, the act does not take place. An action does not take place until the individual has rationalized and justified it for himself or herself. Without opportunity, an individual cannot follow their own motivation, even if the justification exists. Likewise, without the motivation, no individual will come up with the idea of justification, nor would this be possible without the driver of motivation. And finally, without motivation, no one will look for useful opportunities. So based on Donald Davidson's insights into the interdependencies of the three drivers, concrete measures for practice can be derived. To ensure effective fraud risk management, it is necessary to focus on the elimination of at least one of the three drivers. So the ultimate goal should be to eliminate all drivers, which in practice requires a high investment of resources and is therefore illusory. Nevertheless, it is important to consider these three drivers and their interdependencies at different locations in the organizations and their processes, and to initiate appropriate measures. One of the core elements remains the screening of third parties, so individuals and also legal entities, through background investigations. So the risk of becoming a victim of white-collar crime can never be completely eliminated, but active management of the drivers in the form of comprehensive fraud risk management can significantly reduce it. So also the fraud revenge is in particular one of the motives of cybercriminals. And the fraud triangle subsumes the feelings of revenge, primarily due to a lack of appreciation, confirmation, attention, in its various forms under the aspect of justification. So the justification is not always clear from the outset, neither for the cybercriminals nor for the real-world perpetrators in a non-virtual environment. It often only established itself in the course of the crime, and after crossing the magic border between legality and illegality, a justification for one's own actions, very often contrary to one's own values, is worked out. So for this reason, the motives and justifications can neither be kept razor-sharp apart in the real world, nor in the territory of cyber. They always go together, but the opportunity can be separated. So with the human success factor at the center, motivation as a driver of white-collar crime and non-compliance becomes the most relevant and thus essential adjusting screw that needs to be identified, understood, and adjusted. With the drivers as a basis, the manifestations and patterns of fraud are created to achieve the goal. The driving forces, as outlined in these sections, allow the perpetrators to be creative and no less innovative in pursuing their goal, be it as a lone wolf or as a group. So do you remember now the ice cream story of the manager at the very beginning? In his explanation, the fraud triangle was equipped with the following underlying example. The opportunity for the daughter was She was alone at home for half an hour while Dad walks the dog. That's the opportunity. The motive? I'm starving. The rationalization? I'm not allowed to take a slice of bread because it is dangerous to play with a knife when I'm at home alone. I'm not allowed to cook something when I'm alone at home. My brother had an ice cream the other day while I was at school. So you see, I'm sure you could also go along with other examples to explain the fraud triangle to any audience, starting from the kids over to employees, managers, executives, and board members. It is always interesting to observe when the real fraud cases are uncovered with the 3 legs of the fraud triangle. You remember the opportunity, the motive, and the rationalization. Especially to hear the explanation to these 3 legs from the fraudster itself. The pure human factor is playing the key role in the fraud triangle. And not only there. This was episode number 6 of The Human Factor, Corporate Integrity Matters. Following the belief, corporate integrity secures and empowers individuals and organizations. Would you like to learn more, meet peers, and getting qualified? So visit the website Corporate Integrity Concepts or Corporate Integrity Academy. Or do you think this podcast could be interesting for someone you know? Sharing is caring, and we are always happy to welcome your peers to our community. And if you like this episode, subscribe and don't miss any of the future ones. The show notes are, of course, enriched with relevant information, and your connection via any of the social media channels is highly appreciated and will be answered. Promised. And please do not forget, topics of your interest or interview partners are highly welcome. Just send me a note on any of the channels you know. That's it from my side. I thank you for listening. My name is Sonja Stirnimann and I'm your host. Stay curious, actionable, and a role model. Take care and goodbye.